tremendous pleasure of introducing our final keynote speaker, Craig Alexander from Deloitte. It's always tough being the final keynote speaker and summarizing such a tremendous lineup of speakers that have come before you, but Craig is certainly qualified to do that. Craig is the very first chief economist ever for Deloitte. In fact, he's so new that some of the Deloitte alumni did not know that they had a chief economist in their presence, but they do as a result of today's conference. And he was appointed in May of 2018. He was formerly the chief economist at TD Bank Financial Group. He was the vice president of economic analysis at the C.D. Howe Institute, and most recently was the senior vice president and the chief economist of the Conference Board of Canada. So there's no one absolutely better qualified than Craig to summarize and talk about the concluding comments for our conference.
Thanks very much. I'm the last speaker before social hour, so I'm going to try and keep this brief. And I'm actually not going to try and summarize what all the prior speakers said. I looked at the program really carefully, and if you actually read what it says I'm doing closing, summary, and remarks. So if it had been summary and closing remarks, I'd be summarizing. But since it's a closing, summary, and remarks, I'm going to assume that gives me license to say a few things. First of all, I want to congratulate the Canadian Business History Association for the conference. I think that the lineup of speakers has been great. We've covered an awful lot of ground. I have to say, I actually have a personal love of history. When I was going through high school and I was thinking, what do I want to go study at university? I thought, I would love to go and study history. Huge passion. Then I got a little nervous because then I found out that might lead to teaching high school or some other career options that I wasn't wild about. So I decided I'd go into business. At which point I discovered that, man, I hate accounting. So I went into economics. And so in economics, I discovered you can still have a passion for history because there's an enormous stream of research that's on economic history. And one of the most useful areas of economic history that I also discovered is that there's the field of the history of economic thought. And what that does is it actually teaches you the evolution of where we get our economic theories from, like which economists over the ages have come up with theories. And what's remarkable is that the environment they're in actually shapes a great deal of the theory they come up with, right? Like it's no surprise that Keynes was basically writing the general theory after the Great Depression, and that this really shaped a lot of his economic thinking around how should governments respond during downturns. So when the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 erupted, I remember going to a meeting with the Minister of Finance, and one of the other chief economists saying, "We're all Keynesians now." Because in that environment, that was absolutely the right place to be from a policy approach point of view. So I found today's sessions extraordinarily engaging. I learned a lot. I'd never even heard of the Nixon shock. So, I have things I can take away that I've learned from. I do want to say that, one of the things I can tell from the audience and from the questions we got was everyone here I think everyone here is pro-free trade. Everybody here recognizes the benefits. And this issue is very fundamental to the Canadian economy. Right? So if you take imports plus exports as a share of GDP, it's 60%. We're one of the most trade leveraged economies on the planet. And if you actually look at our federation, each province does more North-South trade than we do East-West. Right? We are very much oriented along North-South lines. We are plugged into a North American supply chains. We are part of a North American economy. And so when the theme of this conference is around Canada-U.S. trade negotiations, I mean, this is basically the story of our major trading partner over time, right? And over time, what we've seen is a great deal of success. We have profited enormously from our trade relations with the United States. It has provided us access to a very large market. It has allowed us, the competition created by competing with U.S. firms, having foreign direct investment from America, These are all things that have increased the competitiveness of the Canadian economy. It's boosted productivity in Canada, and that's actually the ultimate goal, right? Like, we tend to think about things in terms of like, well, this will increase trade or this will increase growth, but really what you're really wanting to get to is it going to increase prosperity? And in fact, our trade relations with America has created a lot of prosperity. What's interesting is that we often use, we use certain words to talk about Canadian trade and trade issues, and one of the issues that always comes up is around diversification. It's interesting that StatsCan put out a report in 2017 where they actually did an empirical evaluation of Canadian product export diversification. And actually what it showed was that on international standardized sort of methodology, we actually meet the definition of having a diverse export base. There are periods of time, like when oil prices were over $100 a barrel and we didn't have a massive spread on Western Canada Select, when we did actually have a period where trade diversification dropped. But outside of very exclusive periods where you have really peak commodity booms, man, Canada actually has quite a diversified export base that we don't actually often talk about. When you think about where Canada exports into the United States, what's also interesting is it's actually very diverse across all of the US states. We're actually not concentrated in one area of the United States. We're actually basically exporting across America to all of the US states. And we're exporting different goods to different areas. So we actually have good diversification if you think about it from a US state point of view and our trade relations with the US. What is true is that we are geographically concentrated from a continental point of view, but we're always going to be dominated, or we're always going to be tied into the United States. I mean, we can try and diversify our trade. We should try to diversify our trade because so much economic opportunities lie outside of North America. And a lot of the markets outside of North America are going to be some of the fastest growing markets in the world. So we should strive for trade diversification, but we also shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in point of fact, Canada is basically California with really bad weather. Right? If you look at our population, it's a little smaller than California. Look at our GDP, we're a little smaller than California, and yet we share the entire northern border of the United States. So we are going to be dominated by the United States from a trade point of view. Now, over my career, we've actually seen diversification. Exports the destination of Canadian exports, when I started my career, 86% of our exports went to the United States. Now, exports and services is 70%. And it's interesting because often you hear stats get thrown around like 76%, 75% go to the United States. That's merchandise exports, right? When you include services, it's 70%. And you know what the fastest growing component of trade is? It's services. So this isn't to say that goods aren't important, but the structure of our trade is changing. And so we shouldn't look at this and say, we're too dependent on commodities or we're too dependent on the United States, because there's a lot of trade opportunities that are out there. Yes, we should try and diversify. There's always advantages to trying to tap global markets. When we think about the Canada-U.S. trade relationship, this basically resonates why renegotiation of NAFTA was so critical. And I was very discouraged when a number of the Canadian banks their economics departments put out reports that said, you know what, if we don't renegotiate NAFTA, it's okay, it won't have that big of an impact. And what they did was they went and they looked at the World Trade Organization tariffs and said, if we take those tariffs and we apply them to Canadian products, it'll lower GDP a little bit, but it's not going to have much of an impact because tariffs are so low. And I remember looking at that and saying, that is so naive. Because Trump's not going to just limit himself to what the WTO limits are on tariffs, right? The vulnerability here was significantly larger than what WTO tariffs would have suggested. And so NAFTA renegotiation was absolutely critical. And the risk of protectionism is a clear and present danger. Like in my global economic forecast, there's a number of big risks out there in the global economy, but one of the looming ones is an acceleration or an intensification of the trade war. right? This could actually dampen global economic growth. And understand that if the US and China get into a real trade fight and you hurt the Chinese economy in a really significant way, Canada will get impacted because it'll drive down commodity prices, and this would have, just like in 2015, 2016, we saw, man, the Canadian economy is exposed to commodity price adjustments. So the rise of protectionism is very disconcerting. It is one of the leading economic risks out there. The problem is that the Trump administration talks about trade like it's a zero-sum game. And that's one of the fundamental challenges, right? One of my favorite quotes got put up. Trump said, "Trade wars are good and easy to win." No, trade wars are bad and everybody loses, right? And when you look at trade flows, it's not about, if you're running a surplus in a product, you're winning, and if you're running a deficit in something, you're losing. The whole concept of trade is you specialize in what you're good at, I'll specialize at what I'm good at, we'll then trade products, and you know what? We'll both be better off. And that's actually what the history of trade has shown, that ultimately bringing down barriers to trade has increased prosperity. When the financial crisis of 08-09 hit, it was really remarkable that when the world leaders met, the very first thing they agreed to was they were not going to allow protectionism, because they actually remembered their history. They remembered that protectionism in the wake of the financial crash in the late 20s was the thing that actually was a catalyst to the Great Depression. So for a long time during the period after the financial crisis, the world leaders agreed we weren't going to have protectionism. But now we have the threat of protectionism, and it has to do with what has already been discussed, the fact that not everybody has benefited from globalization equally. It has created winners and losers, and economists always knew that. But the point is that if the people that lose out are a significant enough minority, doesn't have to be a majority, but if it's a significant enough minority, man, it can lead to political consequences that you don't want. And that's what we're seeing in part with Brexit, that's part of what we're seeing with Trump, is a backlash against globalization because people feel like they've been working really hard, they've played by the rules of the game, and in the case of America, a lot of them lost their houses, right? So the system they feel like the system isn't working for them. And so that you have this pushback against globalization, and from a populist point of view, this narrates very well. But you know what? It's a misdiagnosis. Yes, globalization has been disrupted, but for every job that's been disrupted by globalization, at least 4 have been disrupted by technology. And it's the intersection of technology and globalization that's creating the disruption. So if all you do is say, we want to rail against and push back against globalization, and you're not diagnosing the root problem right, you're not going to end up with the outcome you want. And that's what I'm worried about. I mean, ultimately, we have to do a better job in figuring out how to distribute the gains from globalization and technical change. And we have to figure out how to support workers that get disrupted by technology. And so it is disconcerting that there's an attack on the World Trade Order. And it is concerning that protectionism is the easy to go to populist answer. Now, it's very good news that we've reached a tentative deal on USMCA. You can quibble over the details. There's a couple of things I like and a bunch of things I don't like. The one thing is USMCA is not about freer trade. Right? You look at the terms of it, it's about restrictions. It's not about freer trade. When I was at the conference board, we put out a report that was all about, how we could modernize NAFTA, and it was all about how we could, what the art of the possible was. That's not what we got, right? USMCA to me reminds me of the Rolling Stones song, you can't always get what you want, but just sometimes you get what you need. And this is the deal that we can live with. It isn't a dramatic change. We can live with it outside of the Trump term, but understand that it doesn't make the trading regime better. It literally is, it's a deal that blunts US protectionism. Now the big question is, after the midterm elections, will it get ratified? If I had to have a bet with somebody, my bet is, yeah, it will. But the risks have not disappeared. The one thing, though, I want to end on is that when when the Canadian Business History Association is running a conference on trade, one of the things here is about business. And you know what? I think this is really valuable, right? We don't have enough groups that champion business in Canada. If you ask Canadians to name their top 10, their top 10 list of Canadian business leaders, they're going to be hard pressed to come up with 10 names, right? We need to champion business much more in this country. We need to champion success stories. And if you don't champion business leaders and success stories, how are you going to build an entrepreneurial culture? How are you going to build the business leaders of the future? Deloitte has done a number of studies through the Future of Canada Centre, and one of the most interesting ones was where they went out and they surveyed business leaders in Canada and the United States and asked them the question, what should you do to grow your business? And there was no statistical difference between Canadian and US business leaders. Then they asked a more important question. In the last 5 years, what have you done to grow your business? And what they found was that Canadian business leaders were 1/3 more risk averse. So we are in an environment where the government of Canada has been remarkably successful at negotiating trade deals, but in point of fact, the business community have not unlocked the full potential. This is a case of you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. If you look at our trade flows, it's dominated by trade by large corporations, right? An awful lot of Canadian companies are not export oriented. I remember doing a report on this on export-oriented small and medium-sized businesses. And there was a study done by Industry Canada. So it's a bit dated, right? Because it's now changed its name. So that gives you an idea of when the report was written. What it showed was they asked small and medium-sized businesses who were exporters, why did they become an exporter? And 82% of them said it was when a foreign customer asked them if they would ship their product. Can you come up with a more discouraging statistic? It literally was when the world came knocking. They responded by shipping their product and then went, hey, that was okay. We can actually do that, right? And they continued being exporters. But it's a sad testimony that we aren't taking advantage of the activity. Now, when we talk about risk aversion, we still get this, I've seen a number of reports talking about the sort of risk aversion on business leaders in Canada. And one of the things that often come back, and this, the historians in this room are going to love it, is a branch plant mentality, right? Going back to the idea of, we're hidden behind walls and we just service the domestic market, right? And ultimately, we need to change the way we think. So the big challenge I think we have is, we need to negotiate the best trade deals possible. Oh, for heaven's sakes, we have to help businesses navigate what the trade deals mean. We create huge potential, huge opportunities, but businesses don't actually know what CETA does in terms of creating opportunities, right? They need some help to evaluate what the potential is. But we also need businesses to step up to the plate in terms of looking for opportunities to leverage global markets. So the bottom line is that when we think about trade as well, and you look at gazelles, these are fast-growing companies. There are gazelles in every sector of the Canadian economy. You can find gazelles in resources, you can find them in manufacturing, you can find them in services. The key thing to do is to actually help businesses grow. Canada is statistically a very easy place to start a business. Turns out it's a really hard place to scale a business. But I will tell you, you will not scale if you do not engage in global markets. You need to be part of global supply chains, either as a recipient or an exporter, but it's the only way you can scale. And so what can we see? We can see successful Canadian businesses that scale they're involved in international trade, they face international competition, and this drives them to be competitive, build better products, and compete in world markets. Right? And so ultimately, the conversation we've had, a lot of the conversation I think has been really on the trade policy side of things. I think that there's also an issue here about, not only do we have to negotiate the best trade deal possible and blunt protectionism, but we really need to harness the possibility in terms of the potential of Canadian businesses. I wouldn't pick a sector. Man, we're really bad at picking winners and losers. But if you actually make it easier for businesses to export, and if you incent them to export or import, ultimately that's going to drive opportunity and growth and prosperity. So with that, I'll get off my soapbox. But thank you for your time and attention, and I want to congratulate Joe Martin and the CBHA for an excellent conference. And with that, I'll let you go have drinks.